one of the most, if not the most, memorable scenes in the romantic comedy Moonstruck, a 1987 film that still is very popular these days, is the scene at the end when all the different threads of the plot converge together in the Castorini's kitchen where they serve breakfast. Sort of an Italian family with Italian customs and traditions, and so throughout the film, the kitchen is sort of the nerve center of that particular house. All the drama and the comedy sort of plays out there. But we close with this scene at the end of the film that's so memorable. I kind of wanted to share some of that with you. The song that introduces the movie is Dean Martin's That's Amore. It's mostly English, but it's got some Italian words in there. And so the theme is already sort of set that this is going to be something about love, a romantic comedy, both dramatic and also humorous. So the two characters that I'm immediately going to call to your attention are the two leads that are in the kitchen. That's the father, Cosmo Castorini, and then his wife, which is the mother, would be Rose Castorini. Cosmo's been having an affair on her. We've known this the entire film, but it's been kept from Rose, who still figured it out. And now she's ready to confront him. It's quite the scene in a movie that I promise you really is a comedy. Rose looks at her husband with her children sitting around the table and his father sitting at the table as well. Have I been a good wife? And he smiles back at her and nods his head, yes. And then with a stern look, she says, I want you to stop seeing her. And then there's a pregnant pause of silence. One wonders what is going to happen. He stands up. If you've seen the film, you know, he takes his hand and slams it down on the table so loud that his father next to him jumps back. And then he's quiet again, and then he sits down. He looks back at Rose, his wife, and says, and I quote, okay. Little humorous moment, but then she looks at him and goes, and go to confession. He gets that smirk on his face, and he speaks. A man understands one day that his life is built on nothing, and that's a bad, crazy day. Rose, your life is not built on nothing. And then her face becomes tender, and she says, Ti amo. And he looks at her with a little smile, kisses his hand and aims it towards her and says, Ti amo, anch'io. For the longest time, I wondered what they were saying in that scene. It's said so fast, faster than I preached. Italian's a really fast language. Thank goodness I probably don't have Italian. We'd all be left in the lurch. But nevertheless, those words just are not easy to pick out. Most people don't really know what those words are. I've watched the movie since 1987. It's that good. It's repeated watchings. I just assumed she said something like touche. He said touche. Okay, that sort of made sense to me. Ti amo means I love you. Ti amo anch'io means I love you too. Some words about this I love you in Italian. See, English uses the word love for many things. Italian reserves amore, love, amo, as we hear it in the form of I love you too, for strictly the kind of romantic love that I'm speaking about this evening, the love that never fades. Unfortunately, the English language lets us misuse it so many ways. For example, I might tell you, and this is indeed gospel truth, I love the huevos rancheros at El Nepal. It's the best you're going to find in the city. Trust me on that one. But I mean, saying that I love something that you eat, how's that the same thing as looking to another person and say, I love you? And then to trivialize it even further, just to show how degrading the English language can be to the word they're using so many different ways, I'm suddenly reminded when I was in college of a country music singer called Tom T. Hall. And the chorus that was so famous in this song, I Love, goes this way. I love little baby ducks, old pickup trucks, slow-moving trains, and rain. You see, when you use love in all these different places, we lose the power of it But right there, Rose and Cosmo, as they look to each other, their marriage has been through the ringer. He's had an affair. He's now going to move away from there. They're going to have to rebuild their trust again. All that's sort of just implied in that little scene. But they're able to look past all of the faults, all of the weaknesses, all of the heartaches, and go to the snub of the matter that they still love each other. Te amo. Te amo anch'io. That gave me the springboard to look at that first reading from Jeremiah that we got this evening. I've always loved this particular reading because what God says when he places his word into Jeremiah's mouth, he says, before you were born, I knew you. Before you were in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you. Let's parse that for a minute. Before you were in the womb, I knew you. We live in postmodern times. In postmodern thought, it's not possible to know something that does not yet exist. The requirement to know is for something to be in existence. To retranslate, to say, before you existed, I already knew you, which in our sense would make no sense. But God's revealing something about his divine self, that he is a God of love, a God of perfect love. And so we were loved before we even existed. And then when we do exist, that love continues. Psalm 139 was always one of my favorites, speaks about us being knit together in our mother's womb. Another way to think about this whole love is that the notion that it comes from the Old Testament, that God literally acts like a potter who's making something out of clay. It means that he's conceiving in his mind, that he's thinking and doing before the thing comes into existence, the artistic imagination. And that sets a table for us to understand that from the very beginning, in fact, the beginning doesn't say it precisely, for all times, God has quite simply always loved us. Here's the thing about his love that matters the most. Love never fails. I was struck, though, by a song that was popular the year that I was ordained a priest. I've always loved the lyrics, and it's a beautiful romantic ballad by a group called Savage Garden from Australia. It's a #1 hit in the United States at the end of the year. And the chorus of this song, which many of you will know when I start reading to you, is just a more modern version of this very beautiful conversation that we get in Jeremiah, and I think the reference that I'm also making to the scene at the end of Moonstruck. It goes this way. I knew I loved you before I met you. I think I dreamed you into life. I knew I loved you before I met you. I have been waiting all my life. It captures this moment where when we realize we're in love, that it's as if we had dreamed it. It's as if we put it together. It's as if it had always been there. And then that postmodern mind of ours ultimately closes in and says, no, there was not love and now there is love. It's a natural, inferential leap that we make. When I'm working with my couples in marriage preparation, in the first meeting, I ask them at the end of the meeting, how did you meet? From or online, and that's not really a meeting. They have to meet in person for it to be a meeting. But nevertheless, how did you meet? And I love the couple's story. They're always different over the 23 years. But the piece that really unites me to it is how central it is to the romance that emerges from that. And then in the wedding, I like to build out from there. When both of them were knit in their mother's wombs and they were conceived, you see the opportunity for this wedding was already there. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you. And if you're wondering, does that mean we're like a marionette puppet or something? Once again, our theology comes to the rescue. Anytime God acts, he acts with perfectness in such a way that in no way it has free will, something you and I cannot do. And that's why God's love never fails. But that line, I loved you before I met you, is a contemporary way for us to sort of realize how that love literally precedes us before we're even aware of it. When we find it, it was literally like always there. Many couples who've been around for a long time, me and my own relationship, simply say to ourselves that's just always was meant to be. It's just another way to say that. Or as Dean Martin would say, that's Amore. But I want to also mention St. Paul's letter. It's lovely. We read the longer version this evening because it's so eloquent on this idea of love. And it points out all the things that love is not. You know, it's not snobbish. It doesn't put on airs. And then what it does do, it perdures and endures all things. And then you get that lovely phrase in the middle, love never fails. That's a challenge for us because, I don't know about you, but I experience the failure of love rather often. And so that it does fail. Moments of disappointment, some are major, some are minor, but if you live long enough, there are going to be a good number of those moments where you can pretty much pinpoint that love seems to somehow have failed. Particularly if our relationships are dysfunctional, which a lot of them are, that's going to involve some inventory we're making about what's going on with them, and that we can tell ourselves that our love has failed. And actually, we're using the wrong metaphor when we do that, because you see, love never fails, because it is perfect, because it comes from God, who knew before we were formed in the womb, he knew us, and before we were born, he dedicated us. A brief glance to the gospel, because it opens up with Jesus in his hometown saying, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." They immediately recognize that he's Jesus, the son of Joseph, and wonder, where on the H did he get his high horse? How could he be doing anything like that? And ultimately, he will incense them with the reference to how the Jews ignored the prophets, and etc., where they literally take him up to the brow of the cliff to throw him over the top. When we went to the Holy Land 4 years ago, we visited that place called Precipice Hill. It's just on the outside of Nazareth. You get really beautiful views of everything. It's kind of hard to imagine they would throw somebody over the top of that. But that's how angry they were. They were just simply not yet ready to realize the magnificence of God, who was now the Word made flesh and dwelt among us. Love never fails. And because love never fails, every Eucharist, and quite frankly, every sacrament you receive, but let's stay with Eucharist at the moment, every Eucharist works perfectly. No Eucharist fails, because it is the love of God poured out in it. And that epic understanding of a love that never fails starts with where this journey in the Gospel of Luke is going to take us, just like John does, just like Matthew and like Mark does. They all take you to the Passion, and the Passion of Jesus Christ, and his suffering, and then his death on the cross, his burial in the tomb, and then, of course, his resurrection on Easter Sunday. You see, often in the Passion that we read on Good Friday, which is always from the Gospel of John, many people are troubled by those words of our Lord, the last words he speaks in John, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Interpreted one way, it's a bit of anger, it's a poverty of faith, it's a whatever you want to say, that it doesn't seem very loving, it doesn't seem very kind, it seems really out of character for Jesus. But maybe we could rethink those words that seem angry when we hear them. You see, Jesus was perfectly accomplishing the gift of salvation, which means at that moment he uttered those words, "Why you were forsaken," he knew we'd been forsaken, and that was never going to happen again. And the love that poured out from him on the cross is the love that never fails, and the love that continues to give us hope for the life that is to come. You might say, if we were in Italian, that when Jesus says his words of death, what he really says is, "Ti amo," I love you. And when we celebrate the liturgies we're doing this evening, the ritual liturgy, by itself, ritual is ritual. It's predictable. We have words. We're going to say the same things. That only works when you've got a group together. You've got to kind of say the same words in order for everything to come together. The danger of ritual is that it ultimately kind of bleeds itself and we kind of forget what's really taking place. Let me just say it this way. The ritual, the back and forth between the presider and the assembly, all through the liturgy, is rather simply understood by Rose and Cosmo at their breakfast table at the end of Moonstruck. It's just repeated ways to say, "Ti amo," I love you, and repeated ways that we say back, "Ti amo anch'io," I love you too. It's in every part, in every syllable, every place of that liturgy contains these continual reminders that before we were formed in the womb, God knew us, and before we were born, he dedicated us. But I've been too dismissive of the challenges you and I have, where we at least get the sense that love has failed. And the struggling that we have, the suffering that we have, it can't be easily dismissed. It's such a part of the human life. And maybe that's how we can get the Lord's angry words on the cross to also contain tender words in there, "Ti amo," I love you. There was a song in the film that came out a few years ago called Call Me By Your Name. That's the lead song, the romantic song for the film, that really powerfully expresses this darker side that we sometimes go. It says, "How much sorrow can I take? Blackbird on my shoulder. And what difference does it make when this love is over? Shall I sleep within your bed, river of unhappiness? Hold your hands upon my head till I breathe my last breath. Oh, woe, woe is me, the last time that you touched me. Oh, will wonders ever cease? Blessed be the mystery of love." There at Calvary, there at the Castorini's breakfast table, and there in all the different things that happen in our lives, the twists and the turns, lies the nub of everything. It always is an experience of suffering, but its dimension isn't that it's not the only thing we are left with. Something else is behind it. And what I love about the song is it says at the end, after calculating all the sorrows, blessed be the mystery of love. Turns out the nuns that taught us in Catholic grade school were right. It's a mystery. And as a result, a mystery that cannot be comprehended, although we would love to be able to do that in this life, that can only be believed in, it can only be achieved when, as St. Paul says, eye has not seen and ear has not heard what God has ready for those who love him. You see, we can count on that because love never fails. That favorite novel that I read this summer also had a wonderful scene at the end of it. And it's a couple whose romance has stopped because it's reached a breaking point, and it looks like it's simply not going to be able to continue. And they're standing together, and these words come towards the end of the novel. "We fell into a silence as if there were no words to say what we had to say. I knew he wanted to say he was sorry, and I wanted to say I was sorry too. But it was unnecessary to acknowledge the hurt because the hurt was gone now. And it was unnecessary to say, I love you at that moment because sometimes it felt cheap to say such an obvious thing. So it was better to keep the silence because it was so rare and so sacred." In almost every encounter we have where we pray to God, God remains silent. He doesn't speak back. Literally never. The silence, which is the stumbling block for many people in their spirituality, suddenly have offered to us the silence as something else. That the silence is something sacred and holy. You see, blessed be the mystery of love. There's mystery built into that silence. There's just simply no way you and I can know what's being prepared for us in the life to come. We'll have to die to get there. We're not really trying to find that out right now. And so that is just the nature of the life that we live. We never solve the mystery of love in this life. We never see everything firmly worked out. You see, heaven wouldn't be heaven if that wasn't the place of perfection. So back to Cosmo and Rose, because their words are so enchanting now that we know them. Even amidst the failing of their marriage and all of the difficulties that happened, they learned that the love that really cemented them together in the first place, the only love that really mattered, the love that comes from God, never fails. You might say, love wins. But you can say that conversation, once again, which is part of our ritual, it's said beautifully in the film. Ti amo, I love you. Ti amo, anch'io, I love you too. But let's finish differently. In the words of Dean Martin, the last two words you hear in that wonderful film, Moonstruck, that's Amore. Let us now stand to profess our faith.